Good morning. I hope you all are doing well. I know, like everyone's saying, crazy times. I hope that we can continue to have productive conversations. My goal is just to help you get through the rest of this semester and stay on track. That means the assignments have been spaced out a little bit more, cut out a couple full weeks of work, unfortunately, but I'm hoping that we can get some good content in and have a productive rest of the semester. That being said, the test for this unit is going to look a little bit differently because it's going to be online. And I'm still going to ask some multiple choice questions and some objective facts, but there are going to be more short answer paragraph, not essay, but just short answer type of questions like you had on your last test. I will try to post a list of possible short answer questions that I'll choose from, like I'll have a bank. And then when you have your next test, you'll have known how to prepare. So basically, if you're reading the text and doing the prompts for the reading guides and discussions, the questions will come from those. I also want to show you the sway that I prepared. I sent you a link to that. Instead of having a bunch of PowerPoints for you to watch, I'm going to have all of the notes on the sway document. So I'm going to actually switch to that right now. And so this is what the link looks like when it's in display mode. I have the PowerPoints from Bierce. We'll just move down, and Gilman. And so today I'm just going to briefly cover Kate Chopin. You read At the Canadian Ball and The Storm a couple weeks ago, so it's been a while. It's not fresh on your memory, but I wanted to just go over a few things about Kate Chopin that you should know for the test, as well as talk about some of your discussion points, which I thought were really good. So Kate Chopin was, she was wealthy. She was the daughter of a Frenchman and Irish woman. And I mentioned that just because I feel like especially with O Pioneers that you're reading, we're getting into a lot more of looking at people's backgrounds, where people come from, the immigrant locations as you're reading from Sweden and from Czech. So she did have that immigrant background. She loved the music and the arts and married and lived in Louisiana. So she was an observer of the Louisiana culture. This was at the height of racial tension during Reconstruction. So we're post-Civil War, but you still have a lot of racial tension in the United States. Her most famous text is The Awakening. It was written and published 1899. A lot of you very astutely pointed out that her short story, The Storm, even though it was written in 1898, it was not published until 1969. This was during the sexual revolution and civil rights movement. And I appreciated that you had looked that up. I think several of you mentioned that it was not published because it was considered too vulgar. It has very explicit, for the time, description of sexuality. However, The Awakening was actually published, and this longer novel is actually very, very similar to The Storm. You have a woman who is married and she's not feeling fulfilled in her life, and she has an extramarital affair. A lot of the same nature symbolism guides this story, kind of leading the reader to believe that individuals in the story are caught in this cycle of nature driving them to fulfill their impulses. Like the storm, it was considered by many to be somewhat vulgar, especially since it talked about women's sexual desire. That was a topic that people ignored, didn't even want to admit was a reality, especially didn't want to read about in literature. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about your comments. I thought some of you had some really great insights that I hadn't thought of or it was not in my purview. And some of your comments actually drove me to do a little bit more research. So here's what you came up with. And again, I've divided these into thematic sections. Most likely on your test, I'm going to ask you, similar to the last test, explain naturalism and how you see that in a work like Kate Chopin's The Storm. So many of you pointed out that the nature drives the plot in this story. Sorry, Avery, I misspelled your name. But just the crop failure at the beginning of the story from the cyclone drives Alcée to the ball. A couple of you mentioned that the sexual encounter actually parallels with the storm. You've got the storm imagery, and then when it ends, the sun comes out, the rain was over, and the sun was turning the glistening green world into a palace of gems. There's kind of this beautiful aftermath of it. I wanted to point out something Macy said that I found to be fascinating that she learned in her psychology class, and that's this term called universal misattribution error. And so psychologists have actually named this phenomenon that people attribute their feelings to the wrong stimulus. Now, naturalists would not have said this was a wrong stimulus. They would have said their feelings were a direct result of the nature around them. But I guess modern psychologists have pointed out that that is an error. All right, another feature of naturalism would be this human sexuality. Obviously, you see less of a sense of philosophy and thinking about romantic relationships with the head or through morality, and it's more about body and innate lust, desire. Catherine pointed out something that I think is very, very true to what Chopin was trying to get at in these stories, that marriage and sexual fulfillment can actually be two different things. This would be kind of a revolutionary thought, as many people would say sexual fulfillment is only found in marriage. And she kind of shows the opposite. She shows how marriage is very much a social construct. It's binding in society. But sexual fulfillment doesn't have to be. It's something that's natural in one's body. It's also fleeting. So you notice at the end of the affair, it ends, it's over. They both go back to their families. There's no punishment. And just as it did its readers throughout, since it was published in 1969, people are very divided about the ending, wondering why Chopin didn't punish the two. Maybe she just wanted to show a realistic representation. Maybe she was praising the two for fulfilling their natural desires. But whatever happens, this is realist literature. It's not necessarily going to have that kind of moral closure. Of course, this leads into a discussion of women. So Kate Chopin was a feminist, unlike Bradstreet, obviously, unlike Sojourner Truth or Gilman, who are speaking for women's rights because they have been oppressed, either their health or through race. For Chopin, it was important that women had freedom to choose their own morality. I think Esther mentioned that um, Chopin wanted women to acknowledge their sexual impulses. There's also kind of this breaking of ideals. So Catherine pointed out this text shows that a woman could be a dutiful wife without necessarily being a faithful spouse. That sounds a little contradictory to many of our worldviews, but she was trying to break that construct. This was a different form of feminism, one that focused more on individual pleasure and rights. This was 1898, so she, again, like many of the authors we've read, was ahead of her time. This kind of thinking was again revisited later in the 20th century. And then finally, with social Darwinism and race, as you see in the first text at the ball, the Canadian ball, marriage and courtship were largely influenced by racial and class barriers. So the act of adultery was not simply part of the text to be radical in the sense of morality. It was also a sign that these individuals could break other codes, other racial and class barriers through their sexuality. Naturalism suggests that a person could be doomed based on environmental factors and race. I think this is a question that comes up in naturalist text. Are these characters actually doomed based on environment, or do they have choice? And I appreciated that quite a few of you mentioned these characters do have choice and they are responsible for their actions. Haley and Alex noted another aspect of naturalism in this text, in that there seems to be this emphasis on the survival of the fittest, in that the actual mating that you see in the text is between the most attractive individuals. So I actually thought this was interesting because many of you just kind of used the word chemistry, like they seem to have chemistry with one another. What's interesting about this word in terms of relationships, we use it all the time. We say, oh, I need to feel that spark. I need to have chemistry with someone. This is a relatively recent term, in that 1876, I believe, from the Oxford English Dictionary, was the first use of the word chemistry in relation to relationships. So I think naturalism and realism had a huge effect on how we even perceive romantic relationships today. Before the late 19th century, chemistry wasn't one of those necessary elements to a relationship. I also appreciated Reagan doing some translation work for us. That there's a few passages where Calixta is constantly referred to a Spaniard. And this is important because there are different hints throughout both of the texts and the way Calixta's hair is described, that she is considered to be kind of this exotic woman that has a lot of features of the Spanish and Creole nature. Many people would have seen this type of woman as more sexually promiscuous. And I think that that poses a couple of questions. Many of you said Calixta kind of was liberated by this element, by her sexuality. But do you really think that Chopin's perspective is liberating to women of color? Or does it just perpetuate that stereotype that there are certain women who tend to be more sexual, more promiscuous, and therefore perhaps less moral? And that's a pretty dangerous stereotype to make about the exotic woman. So like I said, your reviews on these stories were mixed, whether the ending was satisfying or not. Actually, I think most of you said it wasn't satisfying. I completely understand that. But I do appreciate what Sam said, that this text, it's not necessarily meant to punish immorality. It's supposed to show the real human condition. And this is a reality. Affairs uh, have been a part of human human history. This is nothing new, and it poses the question: is it the text's job or the author's job to punish immorality, or does the author need to just represent what is true? And this text shows what is true, what is reality. And many of you said that you pointed out that psychological realism, these characters are more complex because they show that vulnerability, and they're not just good or bad characters. They're uh, kind of fully fleshed out. All right, so let me pause for a second, and let's return here. Sorry, I'm still figuring out the Zoom a little bit. And okay, well, I am going to, there we go. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about in this brief video is that I want to go over the test. I'm trying to figure out how to do that. If you want to individually talk to me about the last test, feel free to set up a conference with me. I was overall pleased. It followed the trends of what I expect. Quite a few A's, about 65% of the class made A's, and there wasn't a curve because there were several over 100 grades. For those of you who didn't do as well as you had wanted to, I'm happy to talk to you about strategies for doing better on the next test. I think those of you who studied in class, most of you on that review day did very, very well. So that is kind of my suggestion. And if that didn't work for you, then we'll talk about other strategies. I'm going to talk about the O Pioneers project next week. I'm going to do the project that I originally had planned to do with Steinbach on O Pioneers. So you'll have a couple weeks to read and discuss, and then the week of Good Friday is kind of when you'll be working on that project. I don't want to overload you with information, so that's why I'm not going over everything today. Let me know if you have any questions. I'm hoping that the discussion threads work well. And don't forget, next Friday, if you want some extra credit on the next test, I'm going to be hosting a live Zoom during your class time where we can just chat. I want to hear what you have to say about O Pioneers, if you're finished with it or almost finished with it. I think by that time, you'll have read the most important climactic scenes. All right, thank you for listening. I will talk to you later. Bye.